Welcome to the Business of Property podcast. I'm Simon.
And I'm Stuart.
We're both property people running our own businesses. This podcast is just us chatting, as we often do, about anything and everything property. Today we thought we'd talk a bit about some of the changes that are definitely and might be coming up in the next year, seeing as it is the start of a year and we can look ahead to the whole of 2020. I'm sure there have been new things thrown up along the way that we're not expecting, but there are a few things that we can predict. So we were just running through them before this, and I think we decided to switch on the microphones as we were talking about EPCs.
Yeah, so it's exciting, isn't it? EPC is so exciting, we thought we'd record it.
Indeed, yes. This podcast's full of excitement.
But the truth is, it is quite important, and we do need to know these things as property investors, landlords. Yep.
So for quite some while, you've not been allowed to rent out properties with an EPC rating below E. And of course, when you rent out properties as well, you have to provide an EPC certificate to your tenants. And coming up in April this year, existing properties or existing tenancies on properties, I say, where the EPC falls below E are no longer allowed. So
can I just quickly clarify? Because I like to do this, when someone talks about things, just in case the people that listen. So EPC, we're talking about energy performance chart.
Certificate.
Energy performance.
I could be wrong.
No, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. Which grades the performance or lack of, in terms of energy, of the property.
Yeah, so it's how energy efficient a property is.
Yeah.
So if you've got a super duper modern property, you'll probably get an A or a B rating on it. If you've got an ancient castle or something which has no insulation and no windows, then you'll be down at the F or worse end of the scale.
You may have some castles in the Pither family that we haven't.
No, sadly not. I would quite like a castle, though. Actually, that's definitely on my sort of dream list. If I ever make enough of a fortune, I'll
put it down in your objectives.
Yep,
put it down on the vision board.
Yep. Sort of maybe not a 2020 goal, but perhaps a 2030 or 2040 goal, maybe.
I know what to get you for Christmas now. Lego castle.
Actually, my son has got the Hogwarts castle, the mini set. So the bricks. I think the bricks are full size, but it makes a mini castle. Right. It's pretty cool. But anyway, we've got a little sidetracked. We were talking about EPCs.
Yeah.
So it measures all sorts of things. So ranging from insulation through to how efficient the light bulbs are that you're using, and lots of things in between. And gives you an overall score for your property.
Which is a good point, because actually you get mini EPCs on the light bulb boxes, don't you? I think they show...
I don't think they're EPCs, but they include energy performance ratings of some description.
Which is calculated in your EPC, I believe, which is just the point you're making, I think.
Yep, indeed, yeah. Person doing an EPC will go around and look at the light bulbs in your property. And if
don't want that job.
And if they're energy efficient, they will that will help towards your rating. And if you've got old style light bulbs still everywhere, one of the recommendations on the EPC will actually be to replace them with nice modern LED ones or similar.
Yeah. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because my initial reaction to it is, well, I want an energy efficient building, whether it's whether I live in it myself or whether I rent it out. I would want, from an environmental perspective, I'd want it to be as energy efficient as possible anyway. So I think on that score, it's important because, as you've said, we're looking at windows, doors, insulation in the loft, how it performs, electric perform, all of that sort of thing, how it performs.
Yep, indeed.
I think what we were talking beforehand, before we decided to switch on the mic, was just around probably my lack of knowledge in the area, because I'd only ever conducted an EPC In fact, the last one I did was a few months ago with a new tenant. But you were just talking about the fact that they last for 10 years.
Yep, indeed, yeah. You do have to provide an EPC with a new tenancy, but once you've got one, it lasts for 10 years. So you can keep reusing that same EPC with any new tenancies during that 10-year period until it expires. And if you ever lose it as well, because obviously it's either a PDF or a physical thing, whatever, but if you ever lose it, they're all available online.
Online, yeah.
So you can just put in an address of any property, probably most likely your own property, but any will do, and download the PDF version of an EPC.
Well, there's an interesting point there, because I've found that website. Again, you wouldn't necessarily find me saying this out on the streets, but the EPC website is actually very useful when I'm doing some due diligence. Not just because, i.e. when I'm looking at a new property. So yes, it'll tell me what the current performance is. So I've looked at properties before which were whatever the lowest rating is, let's say G. So I know if it's a G, we're probably looking, I'd know this from looking at the property, but it would give me a good indication of how up to date that property is internally. Yeah. And also, a lot of them do have the square footage.
Yes, they do indeed. Yeah.
Square meterage. So that doesn't always appear on Rightmove. So I'll use that just to top up my knowledge in terms of overall floor space when I'm thinking about what I'm going to do with the property. And I know I've digressed a bit there, but I just think as the EPC website is quite useful. And again, you won't hear me say that often.
It is actually, and the data behind it as well, which as you say includes square footage, the property address, the EPC rating, number of rooms. There's all sorts of other bits of information there. It's actually publicly available as well, and for free. And it's actually a data set that I'm working on importing into PATMA. To make available for people to do due diligence more easily.
Funnily enough, I was actually going to mention that. So if you're using those data sets,
it's not there yet, but hopefully it will be in the next few months. So there are a number of different data sources that I'm looking at bringing in, and that's one of them.
Yeah. So we're just talking about what EPC means, and you just said so it lasts for 10 years. So again, that was really good knowledge for me just to know that. So actually, once you've got it for 10 years. And also the cost.
Don't be tricked into letting agents saying you have to renew it every year or every tenancy or anything.
Yeah. Again, just to underline that point, it's a 10-year thing. So, and also they're actually fairly inexpensive.
Yep.
Not if you go through letting agents, just FYI.
What's your worst price you've had for an EPC then?
Do you know, it was only a few months ago, but I'm sure. Well, it was a combination of inventory plus EPC, and I'm ballparking it. I can't remember the exact figure, but it was around £200 to £250, including the inventory.
Okay, so an EPC, I would expect you to be paying anywhere between £50 to £100, depending on where you are in the country and who you go with and things.
I spent £35 with a guy that is his only job, and I think that's the difference. So he's now gone into my little folder. Efficient. Yeah, efficient, exactly. He lives his work. He's efficient himself. So he's gone into my little library of people that I'll now go to directly in this area, because that's all he does. And actually, he picked up a couple of errors from previous EPC where you're just getting maybe people that don't have a sole vocation of doing that for a living, that might be doing inventories and bolt on an EPC. And he actually just said they marked down an area of the flat, it's a studio flat, because of a cavity wall. Again, a lot of this, I don't focus on for too long, but it was just interesting that he'd picked some stuff up and just said, well, actually, I think your rating was slightly higher. And obviously, I'm happy with that. Thank you very much. So my view, I wouldn't want to be paying much more than, so now obviously £35 plus VAT, that's 40. For me, I think the range is 40 to 60 quid, but again, probably depends on where you are in the country and who's doing it. But again, got the inventory done by a specific inventory business for under £100. Which all went online. So it's a separate conversation. But I guess my not my laziness, but my my busyness meant that I would just give it to one company and just say, just do all of that. But actually, I'm now, because I'm so focused on cost reduction, means you have to break these things up. But sorry, I digress. Right, so you would look at sort of 50 to 100 quid for an EPC.
I think it's in that range. I can't actually remember.
But your
what
properties
I paid
are bigger.
most recently.
Your properties are bigger, aren't they?
I mean they're all 3 beds, and 3-bed houses. So.
No, and I'm just thinking actually, just before people think that 35 quid's really cheap, I'm just thinking because that was on a studio flat.
Yeah, that's a good point actually. That it does vary depending on the size of the property.
Yeah. So for 30 square, and that's what just made me think. Yeah, because I'm talking about 30 square meters, which, to be honest, isn't much bigger than my front room. So when he's given that information, he knows.
And you say you don't live in a castle.
I mean, it's a nice property. I tell you what, actually, a good point. The property I rent, the EPC, I should see that. It's pretty low, based on some of the gales we've been having. But anyway, don't want to digress again.
You should have seen that before you moved in.
Probably did, Simon. Probably did. Probably wasn't that focused on it.
Another bit of paper to put in the pile, yeah. Yes, exactly. I have a pile of paper like that too.
So, EPC, but from April?
Yep. From April, any existing properties that are let that have a rating below E need to be improved.
Yeah.
So it could be as simple as replacing the light bulbs. Might push it up and over the threshold. Yeah. Or you say maybe adding in cavity wall insulation or loft insulation or whatever. But once you get an EPC, it will come with a list of recommendations for what you could do to improve the property and the effect of that improvement as well. So you can sort of go down the list and say, right, I need to do 1, 2, and 3, and that will get me to a decent level.
Yeah. And my question in my head is, well, why should I care about that? Well, you should care depending on what your strategy is. So for me, I do care because a large percentage of the properties I have are student rented, and one of the other properties I rent bills inclusive. So big drive
that
of mine.
Matters for you. Yeah.
I do give a monkeys.
Indeed. Yeah. So the more efficient you can make it, the cheaper your bills will be.
Yeah. Maybe not immediately, but over the longer term. So I've put things like timer stats in all of my properties, which limit.
We'll have to talk about that on another episode.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so should we move on then? So another thing that's coming into full effect in 2020 is Section 24. So this is a change to the tax regime for private landlords, so individual landlords, different for limited companies. But it's been introduced gradually over the last few years, and it's the removal of finance interest, so typically mortgage interest, as a claimable expense. So,
absolutely ridiculous, isn't it?
I think most people would agree with you. Certainly most people in property, yes.
Yeah.
And it's over the last few years, it's been gradually introduced. So you've been able to claim 75% of it, then 50%, then 25%. And from the tax year beginning April 2020, you can no longer claim any of your mortgage interest or finance costs generally as an expense. Instead, you get a 20% of those costs as a tax credit later on, but your mortgage interest or finance interest is initially counted effectively as profit, which will push up your total profit, and in certain highly geared scenarios and with expensive borrowing and things, it is actually possible to end up making an after-tax loss when you were previously making a before-tax profit, which is a bit of a strange situation to be in. Yeah. But there you go.
You'd like to think that most people would have adjusted what they needed to have adjusted by now with the relevant tax advice. But the thing that strikes me as strange about all of this, I think, is I understand and completely subscribe to the need to I'm trying to think of an easy way to say this, but to better professionalise property investing and landlords. Completely with that, subscribe to that. The bit that I don't understand is how anybody can say that mortgage and you've pointed out a really good point there. That it's not just mortgage interest rate; it's any finance cost against that property or properties.
Yeah.
But in any other business, if you have a shop, you have rates on that shop, you have a lease on that shop. That is a cost to the business. In any other business. So why is it that if we rent properties for £1,000 a month and it costs us £500 a month to provide that service, why we have to exclude that just doesn't make sense in any way, shape or form to me.
Yeah, I agree. I cannot justify it.
Yeah, good. I don't want to have a dust up today.
No, indeed. Though while we're on this topic, just before we move on, I will put in a little tiny plug for PATMA, in so much as there is a free buy-to-let calculator on the site, which includes a Section 24 impact calculation. So you can use that for when you're looking at purchasing a new property, or there's a remortgage version if you've got an existing property you want to do it on. Yeah. And you could actually put sort of a whole portfolio figures into that calculator if you wanted to. It'll give you a little table at the bottom. Make sure you scroll down with the impact of Section 24 and basically the profit or not profit you'll make after tax.
And it's definitely worth looking at because, as we know, a lot of there's been a big. I don't know the exact figures, but anecdotally we know there's been a big migration towards limited company, depending on the size of portfolio. Personally, I still own 2 or 3 properties in a personal name, which I am looking at addressing, but actually not because of Section 24. I'm looking at it for other reasons.
That sounds like another episode being lined up there.
Well, yeah, it's probably more aligned to CGT to be.
Yeah, that's on our to-do list
on
already.
The pad. So yeah, the bottom line is just know the numbers and don't necessarily assume that if you've got one property you'll be better off in a limited company because again it's another conversation. But essentially
it can be very expensive to move properties into a limited company if you've already owned them. Yeah. If you're buying afresh, then that's different. But if you've got properties you need to move, get professional advice. Do the calculations carefully. Yeah.
And as soon as you've got a limited company, this is a separate conversation, but the final point I was saying, as soon as you've got a limited company, you have accountancy costs because I've got one property in one limited company that I do with another business, and the accountancy fees are, negate a lot of the profit. So be careful. Be careful out there.
All right, I think next on our list is tenant fees. So last year the Tenant Fees Act came in, which banned tenant fees. Were you affected by this particularly? Did you charge fees, or did your agents increase their fees where they had been charging tenants before?
Short answer is yes, I've been affected by it, but not in a huge way because only one property's long-term rented. Mm-hmm. The other one actually does affect me because the fees that are now being charged are £250, which might not seem like a huge sum of money, but when you're dealing with £250 at the beginning of a rental, that eats it takes a lot of the revenue away. But then on a large proportion of my portfolio, 90% plus, we never charged fees anyway.
Is that on the student lets?
That's on students.
Oh, interesting. Did the agents you used, did they charge fees for the setup of those students? Or?
No.
Yeah, okay, well that's very interesting.
Yeah,
I'm quite surprised because some of the horror stories you hear are from students being charged crazy fees.
So the model that I've had, and this is one of the reasons I selected the letting agent that I did, was they had a slightly different model, and I subscribed to that model. So it was no deposit, no fees, and something else which I can't remember. But essentially, they had guarantors that they provided. Obviously, the no deposit, no fees and no bills. So no deposit, no fees, no bills. Gave us a bit of a USP a few years ago. A lot of other letting companies have now followed the same model, so we're not quite as unique in the marketplace.
Not necessarily willingly, but yes.
They've had to go that route. So clearly that wouldn't have affected my business in that respect.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So the change for 2020 is that the ban on tenant fees will apply to existing tenancies as well as new ones. So from last year, new tenancies could not include any fees to tenants, but any existing tenancies that had clauses in them that defined fees were still valid. But from June 2020, those clauses in existing tenancy contracts will no longer be valid. So they cannot collect fees any longer, even for existing and agreed contracts. The other element of the Tenant Fees Act was to limit the deposit that could be taken for tenancies, or for new tenancies particularly, to 5 weeks in almost all cases. And that has applied since last year and will continue to apply. Existing tenancies that have larger deposits taken already can potentially can potentially have the difference refunded, and there are tools available in the custodial deposit schemes that allow you to refund the difference between a bigger deposit taken and the 5 week limit. Although I don't believe that that's actually a requirement to do. I think that's optional. So if you need to find out how much you can actually hold as a deposit, there's another free handy calculator on Patma for maximum deposit calculator, and you can go along to the website and find that in the free tools menu. I think that's all really on tenant fees. Unless you've got anything else to throw in there, Stuart?
I don't think there's much more to say at this juncture.
So there are a number of other things that I'm sure are and will come in 2020, and one of the big ones that's been mooted at the end of last year or during last year, and committed to again by the new government is the ending of Section 21. So the Section 21 is the process by which you can serve notice on a tenant without reason, basically, in order to gain your property back. You typically have to give a couple of months' notice, but the tenant has no sort of recourse against that. Yeah.
So we were talking about this briefly, and I think you quite rightly said, we still don't know all the facts. So I'm just putting it out there.
We know very few of them.
Because it's an interesting one. Because I see both sides of this, because I'm actually a tenant as well as a landlord, property investor. So yeah. I feel I'm in a good position to be able to see this, because there are a lot of things I do agree with, and I think we have to take care of tenants and we have to look after, and I'm not even thinking about myself here, but I think most of us morally, ethically, want to make sure that people that live in our properties are not abused in any way. I think that's right. And
I think that they can really feel that it's their home.
Yeah.
Above anything else. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think personally, I feel that quite strongly. And I don't want to digress, but I've got a tenant at the moment that's having some issues with the letting agent, and she's phoned me quite distressed. It's in a multi-let property. She's been quite distressed, and I don't want to distract from Section 21. Sorry,
too many sections.
And this is why, yes, there are too many bloody sections. But the agent kept bringing people round to show the other rooms in the property without giving her the requisite amount of time, i.e. 24 hours. And she wasn't happy about that. And after toing and froing, she's phoned me. And I said, look, if you're unhappy with that, if you want 48 hours, I'll give you 48 hours. You're my tenant. You're very good tenants. And that's a by the way. But I just said, if you're unhappy with that, I'd happily give you 2 days. And she said, I'm really happy to hear that, because the agent said, you really want this other room rented, and therefore they'll do what's necessary. And I said, yeah, I do, but I would never do that at the cost of making tenants unhappy. And that's you. So if they said, well, the person coming in said, oh, well, I can only do it in the next 24 hours, then I just wouldn't let them view. It's as simple as that. And so...
Have you had the follow-up conversation with your agent?
I am now just reviewing an email which I got the tenant to send me. To be honest, the agent's been pretty poor. There's only so much I want to say on what's going to be a public podcast
yes, great.
At this stage. But I'm really unhappy with how they've behaved. Really unhappy with how they've behaved.
Maybe we should park that one until the story's finished.
Let's park that. But bringing it back to Section 21, the point being that we're trying to take care of the tenants. So the point is we're trying to look after tenants by giving them greater rights. And as a landlord, I would accept that. But where does it end? So just back on track. If we've got a contract, and you or I were having a little debate about AST versus in a short hold tenancy, which in my mind is a short agreement, i.e. 6 months, an AST is 6 months agreement. If Section 21 is abolished, meaning we can't serve notice without a good reason, my understanding is that actually there is no short hold tenancy, because even if someone had signed a fixed term agreement for 6 months or a year, you can't then just at the end of that period say, thank you, I need the property back. But that opens up the can of worms about what if we're going to sell it, if we want to move back into it myself.
Yeah, it does open up a very big can of worms. Section 21 is used for a whole plethora of reasons. Obviously, sometimes for landlords needing the house back for whatever reason. Sometimes it's actually just used as a simpler way to evict tenants that are not paying rent. So there's another route to evict tenants in that situation, Section 8.
Just about to say, it's Section 8, isn't it? Yeah.
Yep. And there's a number of different grounds in Section 8. And I think the current proposal is that there will be extra grounds added to Section 8 for things like a landlord wanting the house back to sell and things like that.
Has to be, doesn't it? There has to be some way.
Yeah. But the problem with Section 8 is that it can be much more easily opposed. And you can find yourself having to go through court in order to enforce it more often and less reliably than with Section 21. Back to your point about whether you would still be able to have a short-term tenancy, I think perhaps the answer is not. I think AST is still what we call it, and AST is currently, even though they may have an initial fixed term of 6 months or 12 months, they will then automatically turn into a rolling contract after that anyway, which can then only be terminated by a Section 21 or Section 8 notice. But without Section 21, then yes, a standard AST will have no end to it, I assume.
Yeah, I think the wording is, well, in my mind it's semantics. I'm sure there's a legal connotation around short hold.
I should add, we are not lawyers. Do not take anything we say as legal advice.
Simon, before you continue this, I did half an A level on law, which definitely makes me not a lawyer.
Fair enough.
I don't think I even finished AS level. Didn't have the commitment. No, so absolutely right. We are, as we say in the intro, we are just property people chatting about it. But I think it's a really interesting one because, I'm sure there are legal connotations that will be to the wording of it, and more learned people in legals on this than us will hopefully share more on it. I think for me, as we're talking about this, where I come to is the issue always lies with the problem tenants, doesn't it? That's the concern for me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and touch wood, and fortunately, I haven't had that many. I've had a couple of narrow escapes. I don't know what your experience has been.
I've had some interesting experiences, but anyway, another time.
Yeah, but if when you get that problem tenant, and we've all heard about it in property circles, the likelihood is you're going to be serving Section 8s anyway. You'd imagine that rents aren't going to be paid, and the guidance for them is usually stay put until you get evicted, which unfortunately for the landlords means you're going to have to follow that process. So where I get to is, without knowing all the information, it doesn't sound great, and I'm not liking the sound of it. But as you've quite rightly said, I think we need to know a little bit more, and I'd want to know more about what happens at the end of tenancies, because that's the key for me. Is we might sign up a property for a year knowing full well that we're going to be doing other things with that property, and I've done that very recently where I developed a property and rented it for 6 months knowing that property was either mostly going to be sold, so we're going to redevelop that property, but I just needed someone in it. I'm about to do that again.
Yeah.
So what happens there?
Yeah. I don't know.
We don't. We don't.
And another complication that I've seen other people bring up with the removal of Section 21 is the ability to serve Section 21 on a tenant is removed in certain scenarios. So, for example, when you don't serve the correct paperwork at the beginning of a tenancy, or you don't protect a deposit, that your punishment as a bad landlord is to not be able to serve a Section 21. So then when Section 21 doesn't exist at all, what's your punishment for doing bad things at the start of a tenancy? No one knows.
No.
So there's lots and lots of details still to be sorted out before anything becomes...
And there must be... I work in a land in consultancy with contracts a lot of the time, and I would imagine, again, we're talking about people living in homes, and it's right to talk about that. But if you create a contract where up front we're saying this is no more than a 2-year contract, it is a 2-year contract. By signing this contract, you agree that it's a 2-year contract, and you agree that at the end of the 2 years you will be vacating the property. But, I'm pulling faces which don't come out on a podcast, but surely, that would mean it. Unless, and again, if you've got a caveat in there, unless in the 3 months towards the end you agree a new contract. Do you know what I mean? So that...
Yep, I know what you mean, and I don't know the answer.
No, neither do I, but I'm just saying, so that's, for me...
Yeah.
I don't want to say the words, that would be common sense, but because we all know...
common sense doesn't apply when you're talking about the law or tax.
or the government's instruction around the law and tax in relation to property.
Indeed. We've overrun a bit, so
we have.
I think we should bring things to an end here. The show notes should include a couple of links to some articles with some more details on these things if you're desperate to read more, and they can be found at thebusinessofproperty.com.